that some American dude was living in, who was like really disheveled and distraught because I guess a bunch of his friends had been killed by these monsters up on Mars. He says there's like monsters on Mars. There's like he called it, I think, a plesiosaurus, like like, and I don't know what a plesiosaurus is. I thought a plesiosaurus was a herbivore dinosaur, but he says it's like this dinosaur-looking, reptilian-looking monster thing that's up there that eats people, and it actually chased after him and his friend, and he had to run away from it and dive into where he teleported to the eye socket on the face on Mars, which is huge, which is basically as big as a city. So he was like on the eye, which the eye would be as big as a few city blocks, I would imagine. So anyways, and there's like a hole in the eye where the underground base is. That's just a hole you can walk down, and I guess some monsters don't go down there because they're not smart enough to know that that's where people are. So he goes in there, and then the monster like banged its head as it tried to chase after him, and then it went off. But he says he saw the guy who met him, who was freaking out, had a pet. This just gets weirder and weirder. Had a pet that was part human, and he says a lot of animals up there are part human, part animal. He was part human, so I guess had kind of like a human head, kind of like a monkey head, and the lower body of like a caterpillar. So it moved around by shimmying itself. And so it was going, ar, 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 so like a human, I guess human vocal cords, ar, 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 but barking at him. But then the guy he was with was like, ah, shoo, and it was like, ooh, and it ran off. And he says there's like a stone carving of an elephant, but he says there's horses up there grazing away. And he says there's all kinds of animals up there. He says there's a 40-foot long snake up there, kind of species. So he says there's animals up there. Now he said that it wasn't a sustainable, something about how it wasn't a sustainable environment. You know, how could animals survive if they're not living off of, if there's not enough vegetation to feed them? And he didn't satisfactorily answer that either. He said something about it's not sustainable. Well, how could it not be sustainable if it's been like that for thousands and thousands of years, supposedly since 9,600, or what he says, 9,500, when Atlantis fell here on Earth, because, and this is what he says, and what other people say too, you know, he could have just gotten the information off of somebody else, but, you know, there was like Vega had a supernova or something exploded, a bunch of planets exploded or something, and there was shards from that came and hit the Earth. You know, not accidentally though, they were kind of like redirected to hit the Earth because they wanted to cleanse out the, well, that's another video, cleanse out the Atlantean people. That's another video though, but anyways, up until then the Atlanteans had spaceships that could fly around, and he says that they took off from Lebanon, and that Cairo actually means Mars. So they had like, and you know, Edgar Cayce talks about how they were doing genetic experiments making monsters, you know, part human, part animal, just fucking around. And so then maybe Andrew Basiago's idea is maybe they just left all these animals that they created up on Mars to fend for themselves, and they've been there ever since for the last 9,000 years. But what doesn't add up with what Andrew Basiago says, you know, 9,500 years is a long time. Obviously, it's a self-sustaining environment, and he didn't say that it, you know, implied that it was. So maybe he's full of shit. That's another hole in his story. But anyways, as far as if it's a self-sustaining environment, I mean, we all know that it does have a watery North Pole, North polar caps that melt every day. You know, as the sun comes and melts it and then doesn't melt it. Because I think it does revolve on an axis, on a tilted axis. But, so there are running water on Mars. And there have been, according to Richard Hoagland, you know, rivers from, if they're only, you know, daily, rivers that flow once a day, come out of the earth and flow, and when it gets warm, there have been rivers filmed on Mars. photographed on Mars. And also there are certain, different coloration splatters on Mars. And Richard Hoagland says that NASA deliberately tweaks the colors, but the original color of those darker splotches is actually green. So there's grass on Mars. If there's grass on Mars, well, then you can have rivers. Well, you can have life. And somebody might go, well, there's not enough oxygen. How can you have oxygen without trees? Well, you can very easily have oxygen without trees. People say that 40% of the oxygen in the world comes from the Amazon. Well, they're talking about 40% of the oxygen from plants comes from the Amazon. But I think like 95% of the oxygen, I don't know exactly what the number is, but the vast majority of oxygen that we breathe doesn't come from plants. It comes from microscopic organisms in the ocean. I don't know what kind of life it's called, but the ocean is teeming. I mean, you get like a teaspoon of ocean water and you hold it up to your head, and that ocean water is just, if you could see with your gaseous eyes, just spewing out oxygen into the atmosphere from this like microscopic microbes. That's where we get our oxygen. So if Mars has water, which we know it has water, then you'd think it'd have enough water, and also those little grassy things, and maybe even the algae growing in between the rocks to actually create oxygen. Even though it's not as much oxygen as the Earth, it wouldn't need as much because it's a smaller planet. And if you don't have humans up there, that much life form up there, breathing up the oxygen, maybe you have enough. I don't know. But I'd like to hear an astrophysicist explain to me how they know for sure there's no oxygen on Mars, because we know it has an atmosphere. But anyways, he says that there's all kinds of half human, half animals up on Mars. Anyway, that's what his big passion is to try to convince people that there's life on Mars. And that's what his book is all about, which is linked on, I think, those two interviews I saw. So he says there's a base down there, and he says somebody in the project said that there was like 60,000 American personnel on Mars, but they all live underneath. And somebody else said something about a lot of people, but they all live underneath the surface because they can't go up because there's all these predators. And he says, I guess he guessed that they allowed there to be predators up there to help decompose the bodies of the humans when they die. And that's another part of the story that doesn't make any sense, because if they have the technology to teleport people up there, obviously they would have the technology to cremate bodies. So, or if they or just bury the bodies like you do here, There's dirt up on Mars. I've seen it. It's rocks, but it's dirt too. So you wouldn't keep animals up there just to devour your dead, to keep it sterile. That's another hole in its story. But he also guessed maybe they do it like that just because they didn't want people moving in there. That was kind of like a protector. But because he claims that there's Martians up there, he says that in the days of Atlantis, when we could fly to Mars and back, we had an outpost there, and we had humans living there. And then when the fall of Atlantis came, the people who lived there stayed there, and they've been living there ever since. And he says he met them in America at one of the bases. He says he talked to them, and they were like, they could speak perfect English, and they were like normal humans, except they were a little bit more athletic looking, a little bit stockier looking, he said. But, if there's like people up on Mars, maybe you'd think they would have figured out by now to kill all those big monsters. But maybe they've had a base. They're just living in their base for that long underneath. I don't know. It's just weird. I would think that they would kill those animals by now. But anyways, that's his story. And that's his big passion. It's crazy to think about. But I mean, on the same token about Mars, Phobos, it has two moons, Phobos and something else, and those are supposedly, even though they're still asteroids, they're spaceships. They're spaceship asteroids, hollowed out asteroids. And there was a Russian satellite that was sent there that was supposed